Welcome to Natu Reads, an audio library of revolutionary texts. Chile, an attempt at historic compromise. The real story of the Allende years, by Jorge Palacios. Chapter 10. The Chilean Police and Armed Forces. The Chilean army has a strong internal discipline. It was organized some 100 years ago on the model of the Prussian army. Even today, the uniform reminds one of the Nazi army. The Chilean Navy has traditionally been influenced by the British Navy. As for the Air Force, which is of a more recent vintage, it was modeled after the U.S. Air Force. Since the end of the Second World War, the decisive influence on the Chilean armed forces has come from the United States. 1. The U.S. plans for the militarization of Latin America. The investigation carried out by Roy Hansen established that as early as 1965, 55% of the high-ranking officers of the Chilean army had spent an average of 1 year in the United States or in the Panama Canal Zone, where the anti-guerrilla training is provided. This percentage has increased considerably since then. Between 1950 and 1965, over 2,000 officers of the Chilean Armed Forces received training in various places under U.S. control. Between 1966 and 1973, 1,182 officers were trained in Panama alone. With regard to military aid and arms sales between 1953 and 1966, Chile holds second place in total volume of military supplies, next to Brazil, a country with a population of over 100 million. Neither the aid nor the sales of arms to the Chilean armed forces were stopped during the Allende administration, despite the threats issued by Ambassador Kerry, which shows how the U.S. government trusted the Chilean High Command. The U.S. government's concern for the Latin American armed forces has increased considerably since Rockefeller declared that they were the most secure substitute for the political parties of these countries. As early as 1964, General Robert J. Wood, Director of Military Assistance for the U.S. Department of Defense, pointed out, quote, "There's a security program being implemented for the Alliance for Progress, the basic aim of which is a Latin American military dictatorship," end quote. Such views were already in the document worked out in 1963 by the U.S. Department of Defense, stating the aims of the Military Aid Pact, MAP. Quote, "The MAP also enhances the political aims of the United States through the training programs which bring many foreign military leaders to this country. It serves not only to improve the technical capacity of the military personnel, but also to familiarize them with the requirements of a responsible military leadership in contemporary society," end quote. And what is the motive behind this desire of the U.S. government to develop a military leadership in Latin America? The U.S. Secretary of Defense, Melvin R. Laird, put it this way before the U.S. Congress on June 3, 1969. Quote, "The MAP will make every effort to ensure that every dollar invested as aid will be used in the most effective manner possible to support the external policy and the security of the United States," end quote. The contacts between the Chilean armed forces and the Pentagon, far from diminishing, were stepped up under the Allende government. All of the 21 logistic flights carried out by the Chilean Air Force outside the country took place in the United States. By May 25 of the same year, the high commands of the Chilean armed forces were visited by an admiral and rear admiral, as well as by 2 U.S. generals, one from the Army and the other from the Air Force, representing the Southern Command. Members of the U.S. military mission also participated as guest professors in anti-communist courses given by the military school and the Naval Academy of Playa Anucha in Valparaíso. These are just a few examples illustrating the close and uninterrupted links that exist between the Pentagon and the Latin American high commands. The center of this influence is the Southern Command of the U.S. Armed Forces, whose headquarters are at the Panama Canal. A feature story published by Le Nouvel Observateur in October 1973 gives some idea of these links. It says, quote, "The Panamanians call it the Wall of Shame. It is a barrier of barbed wires and iron bars separating the South American universe from the Canal Zone, which is under U.S. jurisdiction. Behind this wire curtain, the American way of life reigns supreme. Huge buildings house the various departments of an organization which today makes Latin America tremble, the Southern Command. Its latest victory, Chile. The Southern Command is at once an information center, a multidisciplinary military university, and an operational base. In the anti-guerrilla school, thousands of Latin American officers and sub-officers are getting trained for the war against subversion. These officers receive full technical training in the various military schools scattered throughout the Canal Zone. A telecommunications school, a staff school, an aviation school, etc. Underground buildings, corridors carved out of the rock house, the nerve center of a communications system that covers the entire continent. Here, the U.S. officers are in direct contact, by telephone and teletype, with their correspondents established in all the South American capitals, where their role is more important than that of official U.S. ambassadors. An air network is superimposed on the telecommunications system. In order to transport themselves to Rio, Santiago, or Montevideo, the civilian agents and the military pupils of the Southern Command have their own airplanes, their own airports. The creation of the center dates back to the beginning of the 1960s. It reflects the strategic option adopted by Washington after the failure of the Alliance for Progress. Kennedy's generous program, whose aim was to aid those countries which would carry out social and agrarian reforms, collapsed in the face of resistance by the Latin American ruling cliques. In order to stem the Castroite advancement and subversion, the United States decided to play its military card. In the military schools of the Panama Canal Zone, a myth is being generated of solidarity amongst South American soldiers. This psychological action has had great success. Here is its central theme. Quote, "We all have the same concerns. We are patriots, we want reforms, and we have a common enemy, communism." End quote. For the Catholic officers of the Southern armies who generally come from the middle classes, these simplistic formulas have, most often, sufficed to ingrain a rudimentary political consciousness. 35,000 of them received the teachings of the Southern Command. They were the cadres of the armies that took over in Brazil, in Bolivia, in Uruguay, and in Chile. And the solidarity between the guerrillas is not just empty talk. End quote. To corroborate this with a single example among many, let us just point out that Pinochet was in Fort Leavenworth in 1955, at the Southern Command in 1956, and, during the same year, he participated in the military mission of the Chilean Armed Forces to Washington. It is easy to imagine the impact and the influence of these contacts and links of the Chilean military with the U.S. Armed Forces, as well as their role in what took place if one takes into account the relative neglect of the ruling circles towards the armed forces in Chile. In fact, the governments prior to that of Allende took for granted the loyalty of the army to their interests and relied on the solidity of the professional spirit with which it defended them. Moreover, because of the strong influence of a conciliatory and legalist Communist Party, the army did not have to face a powerful mass upsurge, and therefore, these governments were not so worried about increasing the military budget. Normally, the union bureaucrats and the political opportunists provided better service than the army in suppressing the popular masses. In difficult periods of very sharp struggle, it was generally enough to call upon the Carabineros, an organization sufficiently well armed to carry out its functions and highly disciplined. The salaries of the military personnel corresponded to this secondary role which was assigned to them by the ruling classes. The contempt generally exhibited towards them by the Chilean society was yet another source of the soldiers' resentment, which explains, although in a partial and secondary manner, their brutality after the seizure of political power, as well as their inclination to control it completely. Men in uniform were looked at scornfully, especially in the upper classes. The military career itself was synonymous with academic failure or inability to get a professional title. A large number of youth were sent to the military school as punishment for misbehavior in the civilian institutions or for poor academic performance. In addition to all this, there was the frustration of those who have pursued the military career and who have not used their guns for almost 100 years, except on those occasions when the police forces alone were not sufficient to massacre the workers. The study by Roy Hansen, sponsored by the CIA in 1965, correctly points out, quote, "It has been proven that the Chilean army is an organization in decline. This decline was not only reflected in the budget allocated to it, in its rate of growth and its technical deterioration, but also in the decreasing prestige of the military career and the consequent broadening of its social base of recruitment. We have also demonstrated," end quote, he adds, quote, "that the officers are highly conscious of this decline and its implications for themselves, their profession, and their institutional goals," end quote. Hansen then comments, quote, "The decline of the military necessarily generates hostility and resentment, especially against political institutions, and in this way, it acts as an incentive to participate in politics," end quote. The attitude of the ruling circles of rejecting any participation by the military in the state apparatus, together with the fact that they considered them incapable of exercising these functions, not only intensified this incapability, which was very real, but also fed the resentment of those wearing the uniform. Frey himself gave as one of the reasons for the reluctance of the armed forces to intervene in the early period of the Allende government the fact that, quote, "the military, as opposed to that of other South American countries, has no training whatsoever in public administration, and they are very conscious of this," end quote. This was in fact one of the reasons why the military coup was postponed for 3 years. The military wanted to prepare themselves for governing, and they did not want to remain simple puppets of the civilian politicians, even rightist ones. Not too many years were necessary to confirm the predictions of the previously mentioned CIA study concerning the frustrated appetites of the military. In 1969, during the latter part of Frey's term, the movement led by Vio, the Tacnazo, erupted. No doubt, the accuracy of the CIA's prediction was due not only to its having all the facilities needed for its investigation, but also to the fact that it was already working as actively as the Pentagon to ensure that the Chilean armed forces, like those of other countries, would begin to play a leading role in Chilean politics, in line with the recommendations of the Rockefeller Report. Quote, "We are here," end quote, said Vio, remaining in the Tacna regiment after he had been ordered to retire, quote, "to try to prevent the army from collapsing as an institution. If the armed forces collapse, motherland collapses," end quote. Major Arturo Marshall, who was later to play an important role in the organization of the fascist groups during Allende's administration, had refused to attend the Te Deum of the national holiday with his unit, for reasons similar to those which Vio had given a few days earlier. After being dismissed from his position for carrying out this activity, he wrote a letter to the commander-in-chief exonerating himself for his action. He wrote, among other things, that the members of the armed forces, quote, "no longer enjoy the respect they rightly deserve, despite the hypocritical protestations of affectation by way of medals and decorations on the part of those who, at bottom, always consider us as just a necessary evil and not a guarantee of the solidity of the nation," end quote. He called for the, quote, "necessity of real career opportunities for all those who correctly fulfill their duty, the necessity for justice in terms of salaries which must be brought into line with those paid in other public services, and the necessity to find a solution to the inadequacy of training facilities, of equipment, armaments, etc., end quote. He added, quote, "We must draw attention to the fact that all levels of military personnel are fed up with the knowledge that, as an institution, we are not up to the level of the sacred mission entrusted to us. We are fed up with broken promises. We are tired of the administrative inefficiency caused by the system which everyone is confronted with," end quote. Concerning the political parties, he pointed out, quote, Like the majority of the population, we have absolutely no trust in them. The mental blindness which has stricken them forbids any one of us to rely on them for our aspirations. Several times, however, in the course of the formation of the movement, we have been urged from various sides to deviate in one way or the other." End quote. Obviously, the CIA and the Pentagon worked actively to intensify this resentment within the army. The aid, the improvement, and the training which it received from the US assumed all the more importance for it compared to that which it received from the Chilean government. When it came to the repressive plans of the US, aimed at maintaining firm domination over Latin America, after the failure of the reformist plans of the Alliance for Progress, the Chilean military felt that it was accorded the importance that it truly deserved. The military coup, therefore, forms part of imperialism's overall strategy of militarizing the governments of the continent, and on this point, it seems that even the rightist politicians were mistaken, even though the coup was executed to serve their reactionary interests. The resentment of the Chilean military provided an excellent breeding ground for carrying out these plans, which today manifest themselves also in Peru, Bolivia, Argentina, Uruguay, Ecuador, Brazil, and Paraguay. It is possible that some of these countries will return to civilian governments, but the armed forces, if they are not destroyed by the people, will not be an instrument of the civilian politicians, but on the contrary, the latter will be a provisional instrument of the armed forces. The installation of this new policy of U.S. imperialism in Latin America explains many of the features of the coup d'etat in Chile, which are surprising even to its civilian organizers. It explains why, despite Nixon's initial haste, the armed forces were reluctant to be dragged into the adventures of the civilian politicians and decided to act as an obedient body receiving orders from the highest levels. It explains the decision to use all the opportunities offered by the Allende government to train cadres in the factories and state institutions, including the State Department, themselves, despite the suspicions of the right-wing forces. It explains the elimination from Chilean political life of all the political parties and the tendency to put active or retired army people in all the key positions. It explains the active campaign waged by the military junta in all spheres of activity, from the schools to the mass media, to create a public opinion for the importance of the armed forces. Finally, it explains, to a large extent, the brutality of the repression aimed at imposing a long period of military rule by making every effort to suppress all seeds of resistance. The reactionary nature of the high commands of the Chilean armed forces, and their willingness to unite with those who always flattered them, supported them, and indoctrinated them, while the dominant political forces despised them, i.e., their willingness to serve the plans of U.S. imperialism for the domination of the whole continent, also explains the inability of the Allende government to win over not even one single important section of the armed forces. The many efforts which it made in this direction came too late, despite the obvious advantage that none of its predecessors had done anything of the sort before. There were those who had been working for decades within the armed forces and who offered more than a simple participation in a civilian government. They held out the prospect of direct seizure of the government. Furthermore, the Allende government appeared to be in open opposition to their longtime protectors in the Pentagon. Because of this, the spectacular increases of salaries granted to the armed forces were of no use, nor were the increase of the military budget, the housing projects for the soldiers, the important participation that they were granted in the enterprises, in public administration, and in the ministries, nor were the flattering words of public praise. All this was to no avail. The bets had already been placed with the failure of the Alliance for Progress, the greatest effort undertaken to deceive the masses of the people. Lenin pointed out that the ruling classes use, quote, the carrot and the stick, end quote, against the people. That is, deception and repression. It seemed that, for Latin America, the time of the carrot was over, and the only thing left was the stick brandished by the military. 2. Short history of the repressive role played by the Chilean armed forces. Only the armed people can oppose the reactionary armed forces. The essential role of the armed forces in the bourgeois state is to prevent the people from ridding themselves of their exploitation through the only argument that the oppressors understand, that is, revolutionary violence. It is not the people who seek or love violence. The people are subjected to violence on a permanent and daily basis. Lenin points out, quote, "The necessity of systematically educating the masses in this, and precisely this view of violent revolution, lies at the root of the entire teachings of Marx and Engels." End quote. The fact that the sham communist leaders of the CP have given up this basic principle of Marxism should be enough even for the most ignorant to grasp that those individuals do not desire the liberation of the people, but rather want to ally with or substitute themselves for the old exploiters. As a consequence of those unavowed aims, they cannot agree with the smashing up of the bourgeois army, and they can only aspire to take it over by convincing its commanders that they, as phony communists, are nothing but the partners or the successors of the old reactionaries. Therefore, the praise that the leadership of the CP has for the armed forces is no proof of naivete on their part. It is we who would be naive to believe such a thing. Such praise is just as sincere as that coming from all other reactionaries, and as a result, it takes no account of the suffering of the people under their oppression. It is for this reason that even today, despite the terrible extermination carried out by the armed forces against our people, they continue to praise them. More than that, the leadership of the CP actually prepared this extermination, predicted by the genuine Marxists, by systematically advocating blind confidence in the army. On September 19, 1970, 2 weeks after Allende's election, the daily El Siglo, official organ of the CP, stated, quote, "Throughout our history, there is not a single fact which seriously contradicts the idea that the armed forces are in the service of freedom, democracy, and self-determination of the Chilean people. The army founded by O'Higgins can never direct its fire against the people. This would be to negate itself. On the contrary, its raison d'etre is to guarantee that the will of the people will prevail over the base interests, anti-patriotism, and meanness of those who mix up the interests of the fatherland with their own." End quote. Declarations of this type, which are neither accidental nor sporadic, but rather systematic, uttered almost daily before, during, and even now after the fall of Allende's government, are not only a complete abjuration of the basic principles of Marxism, we are already used to that, but they are also, as far as Chile is concerned, a cruel farce and an insult to the thousands and thousands of workers who have been slaughtered by the armed forces since our country existed as an independent nation. Such a cynical and shameless distortion of the history of our country cannot be explained by the simple desire to adulate the military, who know very well what they have done, as they were simply fulfilling their role. It can only be explained by the urge to demonstrate to the army, and to the reactionaries protected by it, their willingness to collaborate by ideologically disarming the people in order to facilitate the task of repression. A brief account of the activities of the army and the police from the turn of the century until the period just preceding the coup of September 11, 1973, will be enough to show to what extent the pro-Soviet phony communists of Chile have falsified history with the intention of being admitted as partners in the present system of exploitation. At the turn of the century, in 1903, 40 dock workers of Valparaiso were slaughtered by the troops in the course of a strike struggle over 1 month over economic demands. In 1905, a large number of workers holding a meeting were murdered with bullets and swords. Many were wounded. In 1906, the Marines of the warship Blanco Encalada, in collaboration with the reactionary white guard called Guardia de Honor, killed scores of workers in the port of Antofagasta, in the northern part of the country, for the crime of holding a meeting. In 1907, in the yard of the Santa Maria School in the northern city of Iquique, there occurred one of the most brutal massacres, at least up until then, in the history of the Chilean proletariat. Tens of thousands of native people were exterminated by the Spanish conquerors. The workers of the saltpeter enterprises were not only exploited to the maximum by the imperialist mines, but they were also swindled by them. They were not paid in money, but instead, they were given tokens issued by the companies. These tokens had to be spent in stores owned by the same imperialist firms. In these stores, not only were the prices charged very high, but the workers were also cheated on the weight or measure of the items that they had to buy there. In order to protest against such extreme forms of despotism, the saltpeter workers organized to march to Iquique. Their only demands were the right for other merchants to establish themselves in the area and for the company to use uniform weights and measures. Once the marchers had gathered in the Santa Maria school, the troops started shooting at the crowd of workers and their families with machine guns. The cannons of 3 warships were pointed towards the city, which was patrolled by the Marines, and the local regiments were strengthened with others brought from Copiapo, Antofagasta, Tacna, and Talca. The report of General Silva Renard himself, who was in charge of the massacre, constituted a most eloquent testimony. This report was published in El Mercurio of Antofagasta on December 22, 1907. It said, quote, "Convinced that it was not possible to wait any longer without compromising the respect for and the prestige of the authorities and the public forces, and realizing that it was also necessary to overcome the rebellion before the day was over, at 3:45 p.m., I ordered a volley from the O'Higgins Regiment towards the roof already mentioned, and another volley from a Marine squad located on Lautaro Street towards the door of the school, where the most rebellious and agitated strikers were to be found. This volley was responded to with revolver and even rifle shots, which wounded 3 soldiers and 2 Marines, and killed 2 grenadiers' horses. I therefore ordered 2 other volleys in a machine gun fire in the direction of the roof where the committee was shouting in the midst of flags and sound of bugles. After this, that is, at most 30 seconds later, the crowd surrendered." End quote. During these 30 seconds, 3,500 workers were assassinated and thousands of others were wounded. In 1919, the armed forces murdered a large number of workers in the refrigerating plants in the southern province of Magallanes, during a demonstration held in the city of Puerto Natales. 1 year after, in the same area, the regional authorities set the premises of the Workers' Federation of Chile on fire while a meeting was being held inside. Not satisfied with this, they shot at the workers who were able to escape from the flames. In 1921, the scene of the massacre was again the Saltpeter Plains. That year, around 8,000 workers were unemployed in the area. Despite this fact, the saltpeter companies took the decision to close down the saltpeter plant of San Gregorio, which employed more than 3,000 workers. The president of the republic himself, Arturo Alessandri, was one of the shareholders of this firm. Faced with the threat of unemployment, the workers of San Gregorio mobilized themselves with the support of the Workers' Federation of Chile. They wanted nothing more than compensation for the layoffs that had been announced, money to return south to their families while awaiting new work, and for the reopening of the businesses which had been closed down to force them to leave. In order to discuss these demands with the employers, they decided to march to the offices of the company. When they got near there, 100 workers were murdered. The next day, the Esmeralda regiment was transferred to San Gregorio. The troops broke into the hospital where the wounded were and smashed their heads with their rifle butts. Afterwards, they formed an actual hunting party against those who had escaped and killed another 100 persons. Many others were taken, bound with barbed wire, to the Antofagasta barracks to be tortured. Things did not change over the next 20 years. In 1925, the workers of the saltpeter plants of Pontevedra and La Coruna were forced to raise demands similar to those that had caused the massacre of 1907. In June 1925, the government of Arturo Alessandri and the saltpeter firms, which had already attracted U.S. capital, took various repressive measures against the workers. Their newspapers were banned, their homes were searched, their leaders put in jail and sent to the south, and the right of assembly was suppressed. In order to protest against this, the workers of some 100 saltpeter enterprises went on strike. Immediately, the troops were sent to suppress the workers with machine guns and even cannons. A landing was made by the cruiser O'Higgins and the destroyer Lynch. The slaughter began at the workshops of Alto San Antonio. The unarmed crowd fled towards the saltpeter plant of La Coruna, leaving numerous wounded on the road. In the meantime, the massacre had also begun at the Pontevedra plant. At La Coruna, where the bulk of the workers were, the buildings were shelled with the heavy artillery of the Aracangua battalion and assaulted by the Marines of the cruiser O'Higgins. Some 600 workers were killed in that place alone. The rest of them surrendered when they were promised that their lives would be spared. Nevertheless, the slaughter continued in the plains against the unarmed workers. They were forced to dig their own graves before being cowardly assassinated. Many others were taken aboard the cruiser O'Higgins and dumped into the high sea. Finally, others were assassinated in the Cabancha velodrome, where they had taken refuge. This systematic slaughter lasted for over 2 months, with a final toll of many thousands of people killed. In 1928, the Minister of War, Colonel Carlos Ibáñez, who had led the massacres of La Coruna and Pontevedra, became President of the Republic as reward for his merits in the service of the reactionaries. In Copiapo, he had over 100 miners killed. Many opponents of the government were thrown into the high sea. In 1934, under the second presidency of Arturo Alessandri, the peasants of the Biobío highlands began to be expelled from their lands to enrich the big landlords. The problem had originated in 1929, when the government had recognized a big landlord's right of ownership over 175,000 hectares of land, on which a large number of settlers were living. As the peasants refused to leave the lands on which they had been living for generations, they were attacked by the military and police forces. Some 500 rebel peasants were made prisoners. They were tied to the cinches of horses and taken to Temuco and Concepcion, cities located hundreds of kilometers away. Out of the total, only 23 arrived at Temuco alive. And the prisoners were only the survivors among those who had been killed on their lands. Under the presidency of González Videla, 1946 to 1952, the murders of workers continued and a legal dictatorship was set up. With the participation of the repressive forces, tens of thousands of people were jailed, tortured, thrown out of work, sent to concentration camps, and deprived of their civil rights. Under the second presidency of Ibáñez, 1952 to 1958, the repressive laws of the previous government continued to be applied. On April 7, 1957, the Carabineros and later the armed forces were used against the sustained demonstrations of the workers and students organized against the price increases and the wage freeze imposed by the US-controlled International Monetary Fund. The government went so far as to release hoodlums from the jails so that their misdeeds could be used to justify the massacre. Several hundred people were killed by the troops. Under the presidency of Jorge Alessandri, 1958 to 1964, son of the butcher of workers of San Gregorio, La Coruna, Ranquil, and Lonquimay in the Biobío highlands, 2 workers were killed and dozens suffered bullet wounds during a national strike. Later on, in 1962, the Air Force shelled the residence of the shanty town of José María Caro, killing 8 and wounding over 40. During the term of the Christian Democrat Eduardo Frei, 1964 to 1970, who had promised a revolution in liberty, the troops attacked the striking workers of the copper mines of El Salvador in order to defend the imperialist interests. Not only workers, but also women and children were killed during the attack. In 1969, the armed police attacked 100 families in the city of Puerto Montt for the crime of occupying a vacant area where they had built some miserable dwellings with planks, tin sheets, and cardboard. 8 townspeople were killed and some 30 others were wounded with bullets. Their modest homes, together with all their belongings, were doused with fuel and set ablaze. Even under the Allende government before the coup d'etat, workers, students, and peasants fell under the blows of the repression, murdered either by the police forces or the big landlords. Some sailors who had dared to oppose the preachings of their officers in favor of the coup d'etat were tortured in the most bestial manner, without opposition from the government, as a prelude to what tens of thousands of people would have to suffer later on. In preparation for the coup d'etat, brutal searches were carried out in working-class areas, trade unions, factories, and in the countryside, causing 1 death and numerous injuries. The civilian police themselves, under the command of a socialist and with a member of the CP as assistant chief, arrested and savagely tortured some activists of a faction of the Socialist Party itself who were advocating the preparation of armed struggle against the military coup. This brief report of the massacres culminating in the bloodbath of September 11, 1973, only includes those slaughters which marked an epoch and does not account for the thousands of workers or students whose deaths were not given significant coverage by the news media because they had been murdered individually during demonstrations. Nevertheless, it can be said that from the turn of the century until the last coup d'etat, over 10,000 people, mainly workers and peasants, have been murdered by the Chilean Armed Forces and police. This is a country where the population reached 10 million only recently. If we add to these the 30 or 40,000 people who were killed during the barbaric massacre that began on September 11, 1973, we arrive at a total of some 50,000 persons. From this short account of the handiwork of the Chilean repressive forces, we can see that since the Second World War, because of the more efficient police control and preventative legal repression, together with the ever-increasing influence of the traditional left-wing parties and their leaders, whose role was to put a brake on the people's struggles, there tended to be less of the large-scale massacres of workers which were frequent in the past. However, considering the end result of this process, whereby deception took precedence over bloody repression, that is, the brutal slaughter carried out by Pinochet and his cronies, which claimed 4 times as many victims as had fallen in more than half a century, it can be seen that the repressive role of the armed forces and police in the service of the exploiters has not changed at all. In order to have a proper idea of the repressive role of the Chilean armed forces and police, it is necessary to keep in mind that we have only listed some of the main massacres carried out against the workers. We would have to add the hundreds and hundreds of thousands of people wounded during these massacres, as well as those who have been tortured, jailed, thrown out of their jobs, sent to concentration camps, and relegated to inhospitable regions, deprived of all rights, or victims of justice of an openly class nature. All this has also been done with the direct support and assistance of the armed and police apparatus, through which the ruling classes exercise their dictatorship. The repression that followed September 11, 1973, was not only characterized by the ferocity of those who fear the people and want to teach them a lesson they will remember for a long time. It was also an expression of the reactionary class rage of the high command and officers of the armed forces and the police who wanted to take revenge in the most cruel manner against those who had dared to call them progressive and supporters of the anti-imperialist and anti-oligarchic reforms. Obviously, they did not want to leave a shadow of doubt concerning which side they stood on, and when they felt used by those whom they hated, they ferociously took revenge. The number is not small of those who have been brutally tortured while having to listen to the slogan of the popular unity repeated to them mockingly by their sadist torturers. Soldado, amigo, el pueblo está contigo. Soldier, my friend, the people are with you. Here, then, is an example of the constitutionalist armed forces and police who, according to some people, never did anything, quote, throughout our history to seriously contradict the idea of an army in the service of freedom, democracy, and self-determination of the Chilean people, end quote. There you have the army founded by O'Higgins, which could never aim its guns against the people, for in doing so, it would have to negate itself. Is it possible to imagine more shameless falsifiers of the history of the Chilean people? Is any greater insult possible to the thousands and thousands who have been massacred by the repressive forces? Another example of the unscrupulousness and unbelievable cynicism of the leaders of the CP, which culminated in their flattery of the Chilean armed forces and police, is the fact that all these massacres received full publicity in the CP's own press before Allende became president. How, then, are we to explain their subsequent amnesia? By the very simple fact that, in the past, before they became part of the government, they had to propagate stories about these massacres in order to frighten the workers and to bind them to their peaceful and parliamentary road. On the other hand, once they had achieved their electoral goal, they had to flatter the armed forces and prettify them in the eyes of the people to make them forget this record of repressive activities. Once in power, the reminder of these massacres would have put them in a very uncomfortable position before both the armed forces and the people. But there is still more to it. Even today, after the monstrous carnage carried out by the Chilean army and police, which has horrified the entire world, the leaders of the CP, in an open letter sent to the Chilean military, persist in claiming that the right has succeeded in destroying, quote, the glorious traditions of the armed forces, end quote, to, quote, tear the army men away from their professional tasks and put them in the service of a minority, end quote, as well as to, quote, convert many of them into hangmen, torturers, and jailers, end quote. We can then ask, if recently, on September 11, 1973, the armed forces were put in service of a minority, torn away from their noble professional tasks, and converted into hangmen, torturers, and jailers, who then was responsible for the massacres of the Santa Maria School, of La Coruna, Ranquil, and Lonquimay, El Salvador, Puerto Montt, and so many others? Who were those who acted as the torturers and jailers under the successive Chilean governments to serve the ruling minority? Who forced the workers, the overwhelming majority of the country, to endure the exploitation and the poverty to which they were submitted by a tiny minority? Can we ignore at will, with Olympian serenity, all these historical facts, while crawling before the armed forces to obtain their pardon?